In Christmas Eve 1945, while most American families gathered around their trees in the glow of post-war hope, the Soder family in Fayetteville, West Virginia prepared for their own quiet celebration. George and Jenny Soder had 10 children, and their modest two-story home was filled with the sounds of laughter and anticipation. By midnight, the children would be tucked into their beds, dreaming of the morning gifts. But by morning, 5 of those children would be gone, and nearly 80 years later, no one knows what happened to them. Chapter 1. George Soder was an Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking business in the small town of Fayetteville. He and his wife Jenny had created a life many would envy: 10 healthy children, a thriving business, and a home they owned outright. But George was also outspoken, particularly about his views on Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy. In a town with a significant Italian-American population, some of whom supported Mussolini's, George's anti-fascist stance made him enemies. In the months leading up to that fateful Christmas Eve, strange things had been happening. George received threatening visits. One man told him his house would be burned and his children destroyed. The local fire chief mentioned faulty wiring, though George had recently had the electrical system checked. The life insurance salesman made ominous predictions when George declined his policies. Were these just coincidences, or was something sinister being planned? Chapter 2. That Christmas Eve seemed normal enough. The family attended a party, came home, and the children began settling in for the night. Marion, the eldest daughter still at home, fell asleep on the couch. Around 1 a.m., she was awakened by the phone ringing. A woman's voice she didn't recognize asked for someone who didn't live there, and Marion could hear strange sounds in the background. Glasses clinking, laughter, a woman's voice calling out. She hung up, checked on the younger children upstairs, and went to bed. At 1:30 a.m., Johnny Soder woke to the smell of smoke. The house was on fire. George and Jenny managed to escape with 4 of their children: Marion, 17, Sylvia, 2, and the 2 eldest sons who had been sleeping downstairs. But 5 children were still upstairs: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5. George tried desperately to reach the upstairs bedroom, but the flames were too intense. He ran outside to get a ladder he kept against the house. It was gone. He tried to move one of his trucks to climb on the roof. Neither would start, despite both working perfectly the day before. Chapter 4. George ran to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. The neighbor said her phone wasn't working. Another neighbor tried from a tavern. The call was placed at 2 a.m., a full half hour after the fire started. The fire department, just 2.5 miles away, didn't arrive until 8 a.m., over 6 hours later. By then, the house had burned to the ground. The fire chief conducted a brief search of the ashes and declared that the fire had burned so hot that the children's bodies had been completely cremated. The case was closed. Cause of fire: faulty wiring. The 5 children dead. But George and Jenny Soder didn't believe it, and the more they investigated, the more convinced they became that their children hadn't died in that fire. Chapter 5. The inconsistencies were staggering. First, the fire itself behaved strangely. It burned hot enough, supposedly to completely cremate 5 bodies, a process that requires temperatures of around 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours in a controlled environment. Yet, household fires rarely exceed 1100 degrees, and this fire burned out in just 45 minutes. Appliances, including a refrigerator, survived intact in the ruins. How could bones be reduced to ash while kitchen appliances remained? Crematoriums use special furnaces and still require pulverizing bone fragments afterward. Professional cremation takes 2 to 3 hours at extreme temperatures. The idea that 5 children were completely cremated, bones and all, in a house fire seemed impossible to anyone who understood the science. Then there was the matter of the ladder. George knew it had been leaning against the house before the fire. After the fire, it was found some distance away at the bottom of an embankment. Someone had moved it, and both of George's truck, which had worked perfectly the day before, suddenly wouldn't start. Later, examination revealed the electrical coils had been removed. Someone wanted to make sure George couldn't reach his children or get help. Chapter 6. The witnesses began coming forward. A woman who drove past the Sodder house at 1 a.m. before the fire started saw 2 men watching the house from a parked car. Another woman reported seeing the 5 Sodder children in a car with several adults the morning after the fire, stopped at a restaurant. The children appeared frightened, and the adults prevented them from speaking. A hotel owner in Charleston, about 50 miles away, claimed she had seen the 4 older Sodder children in her hotel a week after the fire, accompanied by 4 Italian-speaking adults who wouldn't let the children out of their sight. A Charleston woman swore she saw Betty Sodder at a local store. A soldier later came forward to say he had spotted Louis Sodder working at a restaurant in a different state. Were these sightings real? Grief-induced hallucinations, mistaken identities, or evidence that the children were alive? George and Jenny hired a private investigator. He found that the fire chief had in his possession a human heart he had recovered from the fire site, but he had buried it at the scene without letting the family, without performing an autopsy, and without any testing. When it was finally exhumed and examined, the pathologist determined it was a beef liver, possibly placed in the ruins deliberately. The cover-up seemed to go all the way up. Chapter 7. The FBI declined to get involved, calling it a local matter. A tip led George to a photo developer who supposedly had pictures of the children taken after the fire, but the developer mysteriously died before George could speak with him. Another private investigator took $500 from the Sodders and vanished without a trace, never to be heard from again. In the 1950s, someone sent the family a photograph, no return address, no letter, just a photo of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, who would have been in his 20s by then. On the back was written, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie, Eiley Boys, A90132 or 35. The cryptic message has never been decoded. Was it Louis? A cruel hoax? The Sodas hired yet another investigator to track down the photo's origin. He traveled to Kentucky, where the photo had been made from, and he said he was closing in on the truth. Then he called George to tell him to stay by the phone. He would have answers soon. He never called back and was never heard from again. Chapter 8. George and Jenny spent the rest of their lives searching. They erected a billboard along Route 16 with the children's photo, offering a $10,000 reward for information, a massive sum at the time. They drove across the country following leads. They never gave up hope that their children were alive somewhere, taken for reasons they could only guess at. The prevailing theory among the family was that the children had been kidnapped, possibly as retribution for George's outspoken views against Mussolini and the fascist regime. Perhaps they had been taken by someone in the Sicilian mafia or other Italian criminal organizers with connections to fascist sympathizers in America. In this theory, the fire was sent to cover up the kidnapping, and the children were spirited away to be raised by other families, perhaps even in Italy itself. It sounds far-fetched, but the evidence made a tragic accident seem equally unlikely. The threat George received, the strange phone call that woke Marion, the missing ladder and sabotage trucks, the impossibilities of complete cremation, the mysterious witness, the beef liver masquerading as human remains, the photographs sent decades later. Chapter 9. Over the years, alternative theories emerged. Some suggested the children died in the fire after all, and the inconsistencies were simply the result of a small-town investigations in 1945 that lacked resources and expertise. Others proposed they had escaped the fire through a window and were abducted by someone who happened to be nearby. Still, others wondered if someone in the community had helped orchestrate the entire event. George Soder died in 1969 and Jenny in 1989, both never knowing what happened to their children. Of their 10 children, the 5 oldest who survived that night are now deceased, but the story has been passed down through the families and some continue to search for answers. In 2020, a woman came forward claiming to be Betty Soder, saying she had been kidnapped that night and raised by another family. DNA testing was arranged, but she passed away before it could be completed. The house site remains empty, a lot on a hill in Fayetteville, where the Soder family once celebrated Christmas. The billboard is long gone, the reward unclaimed, and 5 children who should have woken up to presents on Christmas morning in 1945 simply vanished into the night. In conclusion, the Soder's children case remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. It asks uncomfortable questions about what we accept as truth, about the reliability of official investigations, about how someone might go to exact revenge. It is a story about a family's unbreakable hope in the face of unimaginable loss. Were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Soder taken from their home that Christmas Eve and hidden away, living out their lives under different names, perhaps never knowing their true family search for them until their dying days, or did they perish in the fire after all, and grieving parents simply couldn't accept the brutal randomness of such a tragedy. We may never know, but on cold December night in Fayetteville, West Virginia, when the winds blow through that empty lot on the hill, some say you can still hear the echoes of a family torn apart by fire and mystery, forever searching, forever waiting, forever wondering what happened to the children who disappeared on Christmas Eve. What really happened to the Sawdust children? Were they truly kidnapped? Or did they truly die in that fire that Christmas Eve? For more stories like this, like, follow, and share.